Hey, g'day. How are you?
Hi, good, thanks. I'm Claire.
It's a pleasure to meet you.
So I would love to talk a bit about the latest vintages, how they were for you, and ask you a few questions about your winemaking style, your Pinot Noirs, etc. With your normal hallmark style, with a lot of whole bunch fermentation, native yeasts, how important do you think this is? And do you think that other producers in Willamette or even in Oregon share the same philosophy?
So I think that at least locally, um, people are not quite as daring or as willing to take a risk, I think, as we are. People here locally do not typically use whole bunch in the way that we do. I think most people here get excited about 10 and 15, 20, 25% whole clusters, which I think is excellent. But I think you've got to go for it. I mean, for me and my own personal style, I typically like 100% whole bunch wines. But it's a bit much, right? It's a bit too much, I think, for most. And so I think we also are looking for a great deal of balance. And so I think that's why we end up with 50% whole cluster for the most part in most of our wines, 40 to 50 in that range. I think that it's something that I wish people would try a bit more. I think of it as very much of an old world technique. Many of the things that we do, are emulating what the great houses of Burgundy have done for a very, very long time. And so, we like to think that, for most of human history, we didn't have destemmers. And, so most wines were made with 100% whole cluster, throughout time. And it adds something. It truly does. It's for us, it's about aromatics and spice, but it's also about tannin. It very much for us is a fourth dimension of tannin. And so we talk about, skin tannin, stem tannin, seed tannin, and oak tannin. And so, stem tannin is it's a part of that. It's a part of the completeness that I think we're looking for, and part of the intensity of structure that I think we're striving for. Because I think our picking decisions are largely dictated on fruit intensity and acid. And so I think having that great deal of tannin from the whole cluster balances the acid that I think we're striving for with every pick.
How would you describe the nature or the personality of Oregon Pinot Noir compared to, say, Sonoma Coast or Russian River Valley? Because I know you're on the same parallel as Burgundy, so much cooler climate. But how does the character of the fruit compare to other AVAs in the States?
I would say quickly, California is quite diverse and quite different than what we're dealing with in Oregon. But I think, the difference between Sonoma Coast and Russian River is maybe a bigger difference than maybe even Sonoma Coast to here, in a lot of ways. But, I think Sonoma Coast much closer to the ocean than we are, but we are very, very similarly impacted by the ocean in that, we are extremely dependent on Pacific Ocean winds coming through the Van Duzer corridor on a nightly basis to really, cool the entire Willamette Valley down. Where we are in the Old Amity Hills, where we are with our site at Cristom, we are directly east of the Van Duzer corridor. So it is directly west of us. And it is, so the winds are ferocious. They're rather intense. And so, that sort of acts very similarly to how like the Petaluma wind gap in California really, sort of funnels that very, very, very cold Pacific Ocean air. But I think overall, how would I characterize the fruit in Oregon is, it's for the most part relatively bright. It's relatively high toned. It's relatively red fruited for the most part. I do think we have some differences really based on soils and soil depth and soil profiles. And, I think our very, very deep basalt soils, our deep volcanic soils are extremely bright and red fruited, very, very high toned, very, very floral. Our shallow volcanic soils can be dark and brooding, almost blue fruited. They can be, blackberry, black cherry, sort of they can even go into, some really dark stuff and really, really kind of cool. Very, very interesting. And I think the sedimentary soils here can act very similarly to that as well. So you have these ancient, 60 million year old ancient seafloor soils here, places like Yamhill Carlton and Ribbon Ridge, and the fruit can be quite dark. The fruit can be quite dark. And so I think a lot of the fruit profile is very much based on soil here. One of the things we're very blessed with at Cristom is we have everything from Witzel soil, which is just about a foot and a half deep, and then so very shallow, very rocky basalt soil. And then we have Gerrie, which you might be more familiar with, perhaps. It's our deepest volcanic soil here in the Willamette Valley. And for example, we have places in Eileen, it's over 10 feet deep of topsoil before you hit a single stone. So when you're in 10 feet of topsoil, those vines typically are producing something very, very red fruited, strawberry, raspberry. And when you're in very, very shallow soils, very rocky soils, the vines are much more stressed, and very, very quickly the fruit profile, I think, shifts. It's everything is on that bell curve. Everything is on that ripening bell curve. But I think it can move very quickly from bright and high toned red into something much darker very quickly in those shallow rocky soils.
Do you think there are very significant differences between the AVAs in Willamette?
We're learning that. I think it's too soon to tell. I think we are still such young, and we are in our infancy. It still feels like maybe we're a toddler in the world of wine. But I think we're learning some of those differences. I think it's, from my perspective, it's much more based on soil. It's much more based on soil than it is on the actual AVA. And so you have places in Yamhill Carlton, for example, which have both sedimentary and volcanic soil. It's sort of this big horseshoe type shaped AVA. And there's volcanic soil as well as sedimentary. And I think that's where it's very difficult to just say, oh, well, Yamhill Carlton is dark and brooding and blackberry. Well, no, there's some really interesting volcanic soils as well that are much brighter and more red. But I think it's too soon to tell. I think we're learning what these AVAs are about. I think soil is the defining factor, perhaps, but also, and we mentioned this wind. I would put that near the top because I think the reason why, like for example, we just had recently approved the Van Duzer AVA, and so it's an AVA right next to the old Amity Hills. But again, almost directly in line with this Van Duzer corridor. So you have almost an entire AVA that's defining itself and differentiating itself based on wind, based on what's happening there with the wind. But it impacts McMinnville and the Willamette Hills and the Van Duzer corridor and the Van Duzer AVA significantly more than Yamhill, Carlton, or Dundee, or Ribbon Ridge, which are 30 miles to the north. 15 to 30 miles, depending on, where you are to the north. So, and they're much more impacted by the Columbia River Gorge. So they're much more impacted by warm wind coming down from the desert in the Columbia River Gorge. So they're actually getting warming winds from the north and from the east, and we're getting basically exclusively cold winds from the west. We're babies out here. I mean, I think the first Pinot Noir was planted in the Willamette Valley in February of 1965. So we don't have as much understanding, I think, as we would like. But I think every year we gain a little bit more perspective.
A couple of final questions from me. Why have you, well, not just you, but a lot of producers in Oregon focused on Pinot Noir? Because we've been tasting a few hundred wines at the moment, and some of the Chardonnays are pretty good as well. And it sounds like the terroir is good for both Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. Why have you only focused on Pinot Noir and not Chardonnay?
We do focus on Chardonnay. We have Chardonnay planted in 3 of our estate vineyards. When we started in 1992 as a company, we were almost half Chardonnay, half Pinot Noir.
Okay.
And so that's, almost 30 years ago. And so I think people recognized in Oregon relatively early that it's a phenomenal place to grow Chard. And I don't know that they put as much focus on it early on and planted it in the very best places.
Mm-hmm.
I think that in the very beginning, 70s, 80s, 90s, I think Pinot Noir was prioritized in the best, sweetest spots of the hillsides. I think that people will have been wisening up over the last 20 years. And I think that there are a number of producers who are putting much more greater focus on it, much more focus on single vineyard, very, very distinct, very unique Chardonnays. So we make an Willamette Hills Chardonnay. That's a blend of everything that we grow and that we also buy. So we buy we buy fruit from 5 different local vineyards, Chardonnay vineyards, and we make an Willamette Hills Chardonnay. And then we also make a Louise vineyard. So we make a single vineyard Chardonnay off of Louise vineyard here on the estate. And so that was planted. All of the Chardonnay here at Cristom was planted between 93 and 97. And then in Louise vineyard, 93 to 97 in Louise vineyard. And then we've been more recently planting in our vineyard named after my father, Paul Gerrie. And then we've been also adding Chardonnay to the very top of the hillside in Eileen vineyard as well. And so we now have Eileen planted, all the way to the very top, to the crest of the hill. And so it's really cold and really windy. And I'm super pumped for a wicked, racy, just acid-driven Chardonnay from Eileen. And we'll actually be getting the very first crop from that this year.
Fantastic.
So just a fourth leaf vines up there.
Great. Do you think other producers are starting to also plant more Chardonnay and shift the focus from Pinot to a bit more Chardonnay? And what's your proportion between the two at the moment?
When we started, we were almost half and half. To fast forward today, we're like 80% Pinot Noir now.
Yeah.
We make we're making right around 1,800 cases of Chardonnay now. I think the problem, honestly, was that people focused too much on Pinot Gris for too long. I think Pinot Gris became the Willamette Valley white, the Oregon white. And I think that was the problem. I think that the better wines, the more interesting wines are Chardonnay and Riesling. There's actually a tremendous opportunity for Riesling here. Dynamic Riesling can be pulled from vines from the Willamette Valley. I think so. People invested too much for too long in Pinot Gris. I think that was a mistake. We ourselves planted a great deal of Pinot Gris between like 93 and 96. We since have grafted over more than half of that to Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir is, probably a little bit held in a little bit higher regard here, probably locally. But I think Chardonnay is starting to gain traction. It's starting to gain a little bit more greater understanding. I think a little bit like anything that it still feels a little new, but I think there are tremendous producers. Lingua Franca with the Larry Stone Vineyard, Evening Land, Walter Scott Wines, Cameron, Bergstrom. They are producing exceptional Chardonnay. Exceptional. I mean, benchmark as a varietal.
Great. Thank you so much. And have a great evening.
Well, thank you. Have a great morning.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for your time. Nice to meet you. Take care.
You too.